Nintendo. A name that most of you need no introduction. Ever since the 1980s, Nintendo has brought joy and happiness throughout generations. PlayStation and Xbox have also given millions of people joy and happiness, but Nintendo just feels so much more different than the others. There are many things that separates Nintendo from other gaming companies, but there is one thing that Nintendo strives in: innovation. We've seen from the Mario and Zelda series that creativity and reimagining pre-existing concepts can create new experiences and just keep everything feeling more fresh and unique. And it's not just their games that keep this, it's their consoles as well. Each console just feels so different from the next and really gives them a unique style and feeling to them. Creativity and risk-taking are pretty much in Nintendo's DNA, and it shows. However, risks can also lead to failure and ideas that are just better left in the dust. And Nintendo's not excluded from this, because they've had their fair share of missteps as well. And no, I'm not just talking about the Wii U. The Wii U looks like a success compared to the consoles that I'm about to talk about. These consoles just really missed their mark and would really just be plagued from bad ideas. But these consoles were important to get a better understanding on what works and what doesn't, so we remember not to repeat the same mistakes that others have made. Nintendo's first console mistake was also their most known mistake. If you're a Nintendo fan, then you already know what this is. This is the notorious Virtual Boy. It would be first released in July of 1995 in Japan, and then later August 1995 in North America, and it would be priced at $180, which that sounds pretty cheap, but adjusted for inflation, that would be $360 in today's money. And even for adjusted in today's money, that's really not that bad. Even though this thing was called the Virtual Boy, there really wasn't anything really virtual about it. This thing is nothing at all like modern headsets are. They just used that as the name just because it was just such an interesting concept of being in the game at that time. The only thing really virtual about it is that you put your head in some goggles and that there's two screens in there. This thing didn't even come with a head strap, which makes sense because this thing is practically looking through a Game Boy, and it doesn't matter which way you turn your head, you're going to be looking at the same image. But they would use the two screens to make it so you would actually get a 3D image in the headset, which is the main reason why it's called the Virtual Boy. And the image that you were shown was just really unpleasing to look at. The gameplay that's being shown right now is pretty much what it looked like. And just this combination of black and red can just really be straining to the eye and can really cause headaches. And that also doesn't help that it tries to do the 3D effect that I was just talking about. And if you don't like that 3D, well, that's too bad because you can't turn it off. Even though this concept would be later into the 3DS and you would actually be able to turn it off, you are stuck with it. And this thing was marketed as a portable console, but it just seems so much of a hassle. There would be a weird stand that you would have to put the Virtual Boy on just to use it. So if you wanted to use this in a car or a plane, you're not gonna have any success. So with the stand, you just have to awkwardly put your elbows on the ground and just play on like that. Then you'd really have to press your face on where the screens are, which can be really exhausting. Compare that to the Game Boy, which was way more portable and such an easier screen to look at. It just made games just more difficult to play for no reason. And speaking of games, there really weren't that many games on here. There would only be 22 games made for the system, and only 14 of those made it to North America. But on a more positive note, these games were made in 32-bit, which is what most game companies were doing at the time. And games such as Virtual Boy Wario Land and Tellero Boxer were actually pretty well received. They just had the displeasure of being on the Virtual Boy. If these games were just put on a different system, then they would have done much better. But even if the games are really good, the experience that the console gives to these games can really just down the quality. It's just sad seeing such good games on just such bad hardware. The Virtual Boy just had such a rough life, and a short one at that. It would be discontinued in Japan on December 1995, and in North America on August 1996. So in Japan, this thing was only on the market for 5 months, and in North America, it was only for a year. And to top that all off, it only sold 770,000 units, which that sounds okay, but if you compare that to the Game Boy, with it being so much more portable and just a much better experience overall, it would sell 118 million units. Even though the Game Boy had multiple different versions and had a 14-year lifespan, you get the idea. The Virtual Boy just wasn't practical and people rather would just play on a Game Boy instead. Even though the ideas of this console would be used on future generations, the Virtual Boy just needed to stay in 1996 and never come back. But there was something great that actually came out in 1996, and that was the Nintendo 64. But there were some failed ideas that tried to help the Nintendo 64 with its competitors. And I'm mostly talking about this. This is the Nintendo 64 DD. DD standing for disk drive. And even though this is technically an add-on for the original Nintendo 64, it would still allow you to play games that you wouldn't have been able to with just a normal Nintendo 64, so I'm counting this. It released in Japan in December of 1999. And it would actually see no releases anywhere else, so it's only available in Japan. And even though this was only in Japan, it would be sold for about the equivalent of $90 US. And adjusted for inflation, that would be $165 US. And I'll let you be the judge if that's too much money for an add-on. So why was the N64 DD even made? All it really did was try to give a little bit more power to the N64 just so it could feel like it had the same amount of power as a PlayStation. And it would do that with the slot that it had on the bottom. And the slot would be used for an entirely different type of cartridge, and it kind of looks more like a floppy disk than a normal cartridge. These cartridges had up to 64 megabytes of storage on it. To put that into perspective, the original N64 cartridges would only be able to hold about 12 megabytes of storage, which sounds like a good step up, but when compared to PlayStation's discs, they'd be able to hold 650 megabytes of storage. So it still doesn't even come close to the PlayStation. Even though the N64 DD was released in 1999, it was first announced back in 1997, and they said that the new Zelda and Kirby games would be on the DD, but that would never happen. Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time would release in 1998. So 1 year before the DD. So then how did they do it? It wouldn't need the DD because Nintendo figured out how to make their normal cartridges up to 32 megabytes of storage. So Ocarina was able to be put on a normal cartridge and not need the DD. And then in 1999, they would figure out how to have even more storage in their cartridges, and they would have up to 64 megabytes of storage. So for Kirby 64, they realized they didn't even need the DD, so they can just put it on a normal cartridge and sell it out, which they did in the year 2000. And this didn't just happen to these two games. This happened to over 60 games that were planned for the DD. Those games were either just put on the normal Nintendo 64, either moved to the GameCube, or just dropped entirely. And for the games for this system, counting new releases, there would only be 9 games for the system, which 4 of them were just Mario Artist, which was like a sequel to Mario Paint. Each game would be a little different from each other, but you get the idea. It just makes sense why this thing was only released in Japan. It's just because this thing was already outdated before it even came out. And just like the Virtual Boy, it would also have a short life. It would be discontinued in February 2001, so it only had a lifespan of a year and 2 months. And the DD just did not sell. It only sold 15,000 units. So if you thought the Virtual Boy was bad, this is just horrible. It was so bad that the Nintendo 64 kept going without it and wasn't officially discontinued until April of 2002. It was almost just like an add-on that just added nothing. So most people just saw no point in buying one at all, which is why the Nintendo 64 DD was just so forgettable. The N64 would keep going and would be loved by millions around the world. Even though the Nintendo 64 would be available in many markets, the Chinese market would not let this console in. And I'll get to that reason in a little bit. So they would never get the Nintendo 64. But there is something that they would get, and it's this interesting thing. This is the IQ player. You might be a little confused on why I'm showing you the controller and not the console itself. Well, to my surprise, this is the console. The IQ player would be released in China in November of 2003, and that was the only place it was available, not even in Japan, and it would cost 498 Chinese dollars, so that would be around 70 US dollars, and for adjusted for inflation, that would be $117. Take this with a grain of salt though, because I'm unsure if 498 Chinese dollars in that time was a lot or a little for their economy. Now the IQ player actually has an interesting history, because of June of 2000, the Chinese government would decide to ban all production and imports of consoles and arcade machines. However, these rules wouldn't be absolute and there would be ways of getting around this, and Nintendo really wanted to get around this, because this ban would create a black market in China where people would get video games illegally. And Nintendo doesn't like when people illegally get their video games. So then how would they bring a Nintendo console into the Chinese market? Even though Nintendo developed the console, the manufacturer was a company named, you guessed it, IQ. And yes, they are a Chinese company, which is how they were able to surpass the ban. And they would bring the IQ player, which even though it has a unique name, this is pretty much just the Nintendo 64 in disguise. But even if that's what this is console is still pretty unique. because they were able to shrink down the Nintendo 64 enough where they could actually put it inside of the controller. And then you would plug the controller into a TV and then you'd be able to play there, which is the same way how plug-and-plays in the early 2000s also did it. And actually, when I'm thinking about it, this console might just be a plug-and-play. You also may notice that the controller is a little different from the normal Nintendo 64 controller. It would pretty much have the exact same buttons, just moved around a bit. Maybe a controller with 3 handles is just too confusing for people. Even though the IQ player is pretty much a Nintendo 64, it didn't have the same access to the same library as the original Nintendo 64 did. It would only have 14 games made for the system. The 14 games that were chosen for this console are all ones that are pretty well-known titles. But interestingly, the Nintendo 64 version of Animal Crossing would be brought onto the IQ, which is something that even North America didn't get. And there were plans to have other games on here too. The back of the box of the IQ player has a screenshot from Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, but that game would never be brought to the IQ. And interestingly about these games, they would never have actual physical cartridges for this thing. You would have to go to the IQ website, plug into the controller, into a computer, and then download the games on the website onto the memory card that was on the controller. However, the memory cards did come with one game for the system, so every IQ player was pretty much bundled with Dr. Mario 64, which having a game bundled with a console is always nice. Nintendo and IQ would actually never make another Chinese exclusive console. They would just keep this specific console for a long time. And then in 2015, China would actually lift the ban that they previously made in the year 2000. So then there was no reason for the IQ to even exist anymore, and then would be discontinued in December of 2016. So surprisingly, this thing had a 13-year lifespan. To put that into perspective, the Nintendo Switch was announced in October of 2016, and even though it was here for a long time, it didn't sell well at all. It's estimated that it sold about 8,000 or 12,000 units. So even though China has a much bigger population, it sold worse than the DD, which was only in Japan, which is interesting because there really wasn't anything wrong with this console. My conclusion is that the Chinese government made sure that this thing didn't really sell too well, which makes sense why nobody even knows that this console even existed. I guess that console's better than nothing in China though. They couldn't even have the GameCube, which the GameCube may have its flaws, but it's still really good. It would struggle with its competitors being the Xbox and PlayStation 2, which the GameCube would lack one big feature that it just didn't have that the PS2 and Xbox did. And they would try to get the GameCube on the same level as those consoles, which they tried to do with this one. This is the Panasonic Q. It would be released in December of 2001, so 3 months after the GameCube. And just like the N64DD, this would be a Japanese exclusive. And since it was a Japanese exclusive, it would be the equivalent of $440 US. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $768. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's pretty expensive. The original GameCube was a pretty good competitor for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, but in classic Nintendo fashion, they would do things a little differently. They just really wanted to curve over piracy with their games. So they came up with a plan for their next console. They would finally use discs for their system, but they'd be a little different. They would make their discs just a little smaller than a normal disc. Even though this would be good for a time, people would obviously get around it. And this disc would cause 2 problems. The first one being, it would only be able to hold 1.5 gigabytes of storage when normal discs were able to hold 8 gigabytes. So games would then have to be a lot smaller for the GameCube. And the other flaw is that GameCube was only allowed to use CDs, but the PS2 and Xbox would be able to do CDs and DVDs. So you would be able to play movies and music on your PS2 or Xbox, which just made the GameCube look pretty bad. This is where the Panasonic Q comes in. Nintendo would partner with Panasonic to create a GameCube that would also allow you to play DVDs. And it's kind of interesting how they figured out how to do this. For the slot, you'd be able to put DVDs, but there'd also be a smaller indentation where GameCube games would be able to go. So now it's more similar like a PS2 or an Xbox. It even came with its own remote, which there's nothing too special about it, it's just a normal remote. And this new slot wouldn't change anything. You'd be able to play any type of DVDs and any type of GameCube game, so it wouldn't be limited. This seems like it should be a really good competitor, but there is one big flaw that made people not get this console. I previously stated that the price for this console was $440, so a little expensive, but the PS2 and Xbox would both be $300. So that would really make people not want to get this if they could just get an Xbox or a PS2 easier. But the Panasonic would look even worse compared to the original GameCube, even though the original GameCube would lack a couple features that would make the price go down to $200 though. So the Panasonic Q was just too expensive. So if you were able to buy a GameCube and a PS2, that would only be $60 more than a Panasonic Q. So people just decided to either get a normal GameCube or one of the other consoles and not buy this. So there's really nothing wrong with the console itself. It was just the pricing. So it makes sense when Nintendo just stuck with the normal GameCube and not this. The Panasonic Q would be discontinued of December of 2003, so only a 2-year lifespan. Compare that to the GameCube, which had a 5-year lifespan. And this console just didn't sell too good either. It sold about 100,000 units. I mean, even the Virtual Boy did better than that, and had a shorter lifespan too. So it's kind of interesting to think about, even though this console tried to be more like its competitors, having it not like its competitors like the original GameCube was just better. Maybe if the Panasonic Q was the same price as its competitors, it would have done better, but it appears that there was just no way around it. So when people are nostalgic about playing GameCube games, they think of the nice purple box that people have come to know and to love, and not the silver weird box that this thing came to be. The original GameCube would keep going until 2006, and then the Wii would take its place, and then it would become the 7th best-selling console in history. Even though the Wii U took its place, Nintendo would still try to want to extend the life of the Wii, because at the time, besides handheld consoles, this would be their best-selling console. And their solution was this. This is the Wii Mini. The only way you're even able to tell is because of the logo, and surprisingly, it would first come out in Canada of December of 2012, and then later in Europe in March of 2013, and then many months later in the US in November of 2013. Yeah, this console didn't even come out in Japan, which I'm surprised. I don't really know why. And it would only cost $100 US. And I'm not gonna adjust for inflation because this thing is pretty recent. The Wii Mini's goal was really just to push the life of the Wii just a little bit more. And they do that by making it cheaper, being $100 compared to the Wii being $250. The lowered price is pretty enticing, but they had to make some sacrifices for it, and some pretty big ones too. First, you wouldn't be able to connect to the internet, so no online play. And with the old Wii, you were able to play old GameCube games on the Wii, but they decided to cut that feature entirely from the Wii Mini. You wouldn't even be able to plug in a GameCube controller, and to top that off, the memory card port would also be removed. So now you can't add any more extra storage to it. So many features were just straight out cut. And to even make it worse, the Wii U was already out at this time, in November of 2012. But it's like you wouldn't be missing out on any Wii games if you bought the Wii U, because the Wii U would be able to play Wii U games and Wii games no problem. So then you could easily upgrade from the Wii to the Wii U. And if you didn't want the Wii U, you could just keep your Wii. So this Wii Mini is just in a very awkward space. If you already had a Wii, there's no reason to get this. And it's not like if you upgrade to a Wii, you're missing out on other Wii games. I feel like the only reason why you'd want to get this at the time is just because it's the cheapest option possible. Even though the Wii Mini would kinda succeed, they would still make more Wii games up until 2020. So when the Wii was discontinued in October of 2013, and yes, that's 2013, not 2023. I made sure to double check this time. You'd still be able to purchase the Wii Mini. So if you really wanted to go with the cheapest option, this really isn't so bad. So the console wasn't bad, it was just in a weird, awkward position. And this console was here for a while. It was here for just a little under 4 years, being discontinued of November of 2017. Nintendo would actually never give an official statement on how much this console's made, so it's technically unknown, but it at least sold 35,000 units. I guess they really just didn't bother giving us an official statement about it. Maybe even Nintendo forgot that this thing even existed. I'm guessing it really wasn't too much, since I really don't see these things ever. So it was an interesting concept that just didn't really work. So now you can clearly see that these were all big missteps for Nintendo. And it's pretty easy to label these as big mistakes that never should have happened. Just a bunch of technology that just led up to no meaning and no purpose. Well, I don't really see it that way. Each one of these consoles just tried to do something a little different and original from the other. And if these mistakes never happened, we wouldn't have known until later. And no matter who you are, you're gonna make mistakes. And you remember your mistakes, so then you don't repeat them over and over again. So you have to at least appreciate their ambition to create something different, even if it ends up in failure. Because if they wanted to, they could completely play it safe and do the same thing over and over again. Which sure, that would be okay, but that would just leave things just feeling stale and just go and be boring. And for that reason is why just so many of their consoles are just so recognizable and loved. Because they always just try to do something different and just reinvent the wheel, which are why these consoles are just so important. Because now these consoles made it so they were able to figure out what works and what doesn't. And with this knowledge, they were able to make consoles that were great. And I know that nobody wants to make mistakes, but when you finally do make something that you're proud of and enjoy, you may think back and you are so happy that you made those mistakes, because you never would have known unless you did.